Hello and welcome to today's town meeting of the LaRouche organization. And today we are asking the question, a lot of people in the world are actually asking this question, who's going to bring Christmas back to Bethlehem? The Israeli Defense Forces killing of 3 of their own soldiers, shot while escaping from Hamas in Gaza, is a metaphor for how the present mass murder and displacement of some 2 million Palestinians will end for everybody, including Israel itself. There's no real principle of victory involved in what we're watching unfold there in Gaza right now, only the triumph of death, only the blind rage that causes Israel to kill its own soldiers, kind of like Saturn eating his own children. Deliberation and not destruction is what we actually need, what the world needs now, both in Gaza and in general. Russian President Vladimir Putin, during his recent 4-hour conversation with the world's press and the Russian people this past week, said of the United States, speaking of the United States, we're ready to talk with them too. We believe that the United States is an important and necessary country for the world. However, their absolutely imperial policy is hurting themselves. It's not even hurting us. It's hurting them first and foremost, because in the public eye, they have to act as an empire. As soon as something changes domestically, this might establish the fundamental conditions that would allow them to respect others, to respect other countries, to seek compromise rather than use force and sanctions. Only then will we see the fundamental conditions to establish full-fledged relations with them. So far, we see nothing, but we are ready. Now, others are too blinded with rage to think. Israeli ambassador to Russia, Alexander Ben-Zvi, told TASS on Saturday that there were no plans whatsoever for a holiday truce in the Gaza conflict. He said, "No, I don't think so, because we have 2 objectives, which I always repeat. They are about the destruction of Hamas terrorist structures and the release of all of our hostages. These are the 2 objectives which we must accomplish. Besides, neither we nor Hamas celebrate Christmas at this time of the year. We celebrate New Year in September. On the whole, it is not the reason for suspending military operations." Now, if the vote of 153 sovereign states of the United Nations is not enough, and if the 2,000-year-old universal cry for peace on earth, goodwill toward all men is not a reason, what is a reason? In fact, let's ask a little bit of a different question. Does the Israeli ambassador and do others even know what reason is any longer? Back about 30 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche, the late economist and statesman, gave a speech called Building a Bridge from Hell to Purgatory. He just kept heaven out of it. He just was interested in keeping things going. And he gave this speech. It was interesting because he actually used as a kind of graphic for that speech the Sinai Peninsula. And at a certain point in that speech, he wanted to try to describe to people his understanding of what makes human beings different from animals. That's the graphic that was used at that time. And so we're going to just play for you an excerpt from that speech. Again, this is 1994. You'll hear a couple of allusions there for that contemporary period. But we think this is valuable just to give you an idea of the kind of statesman that the United States has lost and the character of discussion that's actually required at this time.
The thing which makes man in the image of God is solely one thing. Only one thing is known to man which can show us that man as the individual person is the image of God. And that is the ability of the individual to make fundamental discoveries which are valid, such as those which are fundamental scientific discoveries, such as one made by Cusa, particularly at that time, in the field of geometry. That only the ability to make those kind of axiomatic revolutionary discoveries, which defy all formal logic, as a knowable method of discovery, the universality of this is what makes man in the image of God as creator. Not God as an image, but God as the creator. that man alone, through man's ability to transform the circumstances of man's practice and to transform nature, that man, unlike any other living species in this universe, has shown the capability to make technological changes and cultural changes which increase man's power per capita and per square kilometer over this planet and over the universe as a whole. That man is the only species that can increase the quality and character of its own existence, and it can increase the potential population density of the species. No animal can do this. Man does this only by one quality. That quality of mind which is shown in classical poetry, in the classical music from Haydn and Mozart through Brahms and so forth, in great classical dramas such as that of Aeschylus or Marlowe or Cervantes, Don Quixote, or Shakespeare or Schiller. In these fields of art, of classical art, not dumb art, not rock music, not that garbage, but classical art forms, which all involve the use of a creative principle and evoking a sense of the creative principle within audiences for art and performers within art. But these things, together with the ability to make fundamental scientific discoveries which defy all formal logic, which defy syllogisms. Man who believes in a syllogism is not in the image of God. Only when man believes in his own creativity is he able to recognize that part in himself as an individual, which is in the image of God. Now this idea, which is old, of man in the image of God, you find it reflected in Plato's time. You find it, the embodiment of this in Christianity. You find it, as Philo of Alexandria said, in reading the first chapter of the first book of Moses, which we call Genesis, that man is made in the image of God by virtue of that power which gives him dominion over the earth and over all species within it. This is the idea of Augustinian Christianity, and this was, in 1440, an idea of Western European Christianity, where there was a brief unity between the Greek or the Eastern Rite and the Latin Rite. This was the genius of Christianity, finally, for the first time, embodied in the notion of the modern nation state. Prior to that time, the highest level of population ever achieved on this planet was several 100 million people. In all human existence, prior to the Golden Renaissance, prior to the Council of Florence in 1440, all human existence could not struggle above a level of several 100 million people. And most of those people were very miserable. 95 to 98% of the human population lived in very primitive, crude agriculture. The difference between the man and the beast was a very slight one in daily practice. A few privileged families had great power, and their hangers-on participated in the benefits of that power. But the mass of humanity lived in a condition which was slightly better than that of slavery, if not slavery. Respect for human life was non-existent. The existence of the death penalty is an example of this. Killing people over political issues, killing people who were in your victim, not fighting wars, that's a different matter, but killing people who were within your power by deliberate calculation, the thing we call today the death penalty. That piece of barbarism, that bestiality existed and was prevalent. All kinds of people could exert the death penalty. Country squires could exert the death penalty. You know what an English country squire is. It's a pretty low form of life. Suddenly the dignity of man, not the simple Latin word, imago Dei, that existed for a long time, but very few people who used the word understood it. They didn't understand it to mean creativity. They didn't know what creativity was. And there's another word, Latin phrase that goes with that, capax Dei, the ability to participate in God, which is to participate in the nature of God as the creator through man's ability to create. as we see in classical art forms, as we see in scientific progress, not science, not formal science, not mathematics as a formal mathematics, but as scientific progress, a succession of fundamental discoveries. As a result of that, there was set into motion in Europe, through evangelization and other methods throughout the planet, there was set into motion a fundamental change in mankind around the ideas of the modern nation state. Not everywhere successful, but the idea was there. And the right of people to be individuals, to be sacred in the eyes of God by virtue of that which makes them human individuals, the right to their life not taken away by the caprice of some fool with too much power, and the power and right and obligation to change culture, to change the way we live, to break with traditional culture, to free ourselves from the bestiality of what was known as traditional culture up until the time of the Renaissance. As a result of that, mankind has risen to over 5.3 billion people on this planet today. And in general, up until a recent time, the average condition of life on this planet, of nearly every individual on this planet, was far better than the average condition of mankind throughout this planet in 1400 AD. So on the one side, European civilization, modern European civilization, which began in the year 1440 at the Council of Florence, the most revolutionary, most important event, the pinnacle of all human achievement up to this point, since that time, has been to increase man's power over nature, to create institutions which, if applied, give us unlimited ability to deal and master the material problems of existence and of cultural existence and of dignity of man.
Okay, now our job at the LaRouche organization is to provoke you to think. And what we're going to say to you here is that if you don't start with this level of the discussion, you cannot address what is actually going on in the Southwest Asia crisis. There's one pragmatic reason for that we can give you. Both of the major groups that are fighting, Hamas and Israel, are appealing to their peculiar ideas of religion to justify their actions. Hamas is doing it and Israel is doing it. So unless you address that reality as the military reality of what is motivating or is being used to motivate the opposing forces, how could you possibly address them? They're not hearing you. And so the problem in U.S. foreign policy in the State Department is, can you imagine a Blinken or a Jake Sullivan being able to address things from that standpoint? Can you imagine a late Henry Kissinger addressing things from anything other than a satanic standpoint? So this is the first order of problem that we're considering. And so to start us off, we've got a whole group of people here, some of whom have had some recent contact with other major actors in Southwest Asia, not the ones you're thinking of, but I'm speaking about Russia and I'm speaking about other nations. But to start us off, we're going to go to Harley Schlanger, who is a spokesman for the LaRouche organization, who will sort of give us his overview of where we are. So Harley, good to see you.
Hello, Dennis. Good to be with you. Let me start by taking the two major developments of the last week, the last couple of days, that are the heavy focus of international press attention. And when I say a heavy focus, there's very little clarity that's emerged from that focus. And because they ignore the underlying dynamic, which we just heard from Lyndon LaRouche, what is the actual process by which history unfolds. But I'm going to take a look at two of these events and then give you a little bit of take two other things that happened that show a different process. So let's start with President Zelensky's trip to the United States, which occurred last week, and on the surface was a flop. He was brought here to try to reverse the efforts to withhold funds for Ukraine. It was clear that the Congress has pulled back from that. Perhaps the intent of having him spin his magic before the Congress was the idea, but it was a flop. The idea of giving $60 billion more dollars to Ukraine, or to spread it around the various corporations and the defense contractors and Zelensky's cronies, that's no longer considered a good investment. The counteroffensive failed. Public opinion has turned on the Ukraine war. And the spectacular side of this flop was that all Republicans voted against providing more funds after they heard from Zelensky. Most exemplary was that of Lindsey Graham, who has been bragging about how it's such a great deal to provide $113 billion to Ukraine to kill Russians. That's a great deal. Now he's saying it's no longer a great deal. So there's speculation then, why do this? Why bring Zelensky knowing that there probably would be no shift in the Congress? Is it preparation for dumping him as president? Is there a change in strategy? Both those things may be at play here. I have no specific intelligence to say one way or the other. But what I can tell you is that the intent overall is clear: to keep the war going, to bleed Russia, and to continue the attacks on Putin and the nation of Russia. And the reason for that is not so obvious because you never hear about it. It's to stop the emergence of a new multipolar order, breaking with the unipolar order that is represented by the policies of the Anglo-Americans. So that's the Zelensky flop. Now, the second one, and it's probably another flop, was the trip of Jake Sullivan to Southwest Asia. Now, what we're told is he was sent to deliver a message to Netanyahu following the UN General Assembly vote, which Dennis mentioned, 150 plus nations voting for ceasefire, only 14 opposed. The US protection of Netanyahu is becoming a liability. The United States is isolated. The whole world is moving in a different direction, including voices within Israel, typified by the former Shin Bet head Ami Ayalon, who has said repeatedly recently, there's no military victory over Hamas. The Israelis have to move to a political policy, which includes a two-state solution. That's the only way to guarantee peace. The military can't guarantee peace for Israel. But when Sullivan went there and told them that they need a less intense bombardment of the population in general, and instead a more precise targeting of Hamas, well, is that happening? Well, it's hard to see, but what is clear is that Netanyahu maintains his position that there will be no Palestinian state, and the policy of the war seems to be that there'll be no more Palestinians left in Palestine. So in both of these cases, the Zelensky visit and the Sullivan visit, the Biden is operating with a losing hand, and his NATO allies as well. There's no exit strategy. The continued war means more casualties, more economic distress, more isolation of the United States. But as I said, the broader purpose of this is the attack on the BRICS, the attack on the emergence of the global South as a break with the unipolar order. Now, that's the underlying dynamic in which the Ukraine war and the Gaza war are occurring. Look, it's clear that there are backstories here that go back a way. With Ukraine, you could go back to the period of the Soviet Union. You could start with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You could start with the Maidan coup. The media never does that. They start with February 2022. But there is a backstory on Ukraine, as well as on Israel. It's a much longer backstory that goes back to the Balfour Declaration. It goes back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and so on. But the overall dynamic is being defined by this breakout from the unipolar order. And two ways to look at that. are two other events of the last days. The Putin National Press Conference on December 14th, where he had took dozens of questions from people from all over Russia, and also the European Council Summit, which took place on the 14th and 15th of December. So what insights can we draw for the shape of things to come from looking at those two things? And let me just start by saying that the reason you don't know much about these things is you're a victim of the censorship disinformation complex. That these dynamics, these underlying dynamics, are not covered. The idea that there's a revolt against colonialism. And let me simply say that if you look at whatever you think of Hamas, the Palestinians are a colonial oppressed people. That this is a part of the broader anti-colonial rebellion going on in the world, which is part of the emergence of a new order. So let's just start with the Putin press conference and take a quick look at a couple of things there. Almost 4 hours of questions he took. And imagine Joe Biden taking questions for 40 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes. But Putin had some tough questions. These were not all softballs. There were questions about problems veterans are facing, the cost of living concerns of the average people, and he took the questions head on. But on what he said about the present strategic situation, I think is the most important, and that's what I want to focus on. If I could have the first poster, please, first slide. Putin discussed this question of what is the rules-based order. And he said, as for the rules-based order, there are no such rules in reality. They change every day depending on the current political situation and the immediate interests of whoever is talking about it. How will this affect the situation? It will affect it in the right direction. It will show that there are quite a large number of forces in the world, powerful countries, that want to live not by these unwritten rules, but by the rules prescribed in fundamental documents, including the Charter of the United Nations. And those that are guided by their own interests and the interests of their partners. They do not impose anything on anyone. They do not create any military blocks, but create conditions for joint effective development. This will be the focus, he said, of Russia's work as BRICS chair next year. Now, that's Putin speaking about the question of the direction of world strategic policy. And he said that before, but he went on to make it even more clear when talking about the situation of the puppets of the United States and Europe. And let me have the second slide, please. Putin said many European public figures on the surface are acting like Charles de Gaulle, who was fighting for the interests of France with weapons. He assembled all the French people to show resistance to the occupying forces. However, in practice, they, referring to European leaders, are acting like Marshal Pétain. Even though he was a hero of World War I, in World War II, Pétain was a Nazi collaborationist. He accepted the will of the occupying forces. Almost everyone in Europe behaves this way, except for a few people. Fico, the new leader in Slovakia, Viktor Orban in Hungary. I have said many times that they are not pro-Russia politicians, they are pro-national. They are defending their country's interests, but there are too few politicians like this. I do not know why they do not exist. Maybe this has to do with Europe's excessive dependence on the big brother, the United States. But we are ready to build relations with them. And then he spoke more directly about the United States, and Dennis brought this up earlier, but I'm going to read you this quote again. Putin said, "We are ready to build relations with the United States as well. We believe that America is an important country on the world stage. But this absolutely imperial policy the country pursues is bad for them, not even for us. Why? Because the public expects them to act like an empire. And if they agree to compromise on something or concede something to someone, their voters will see this as a failure or a flaw. That may partly be the reason the elites have to act this way. As soon as they change on a deeper level and begin to respect other people, other countries, start searching for compromises instead of addressing their problems by using sanctions and military force, which would create the underlying conditions for restoring full-fledged relations. So far, there are no such conditions, but we are ready for this. Now, I think it's clear from just these short quotes from Putin that what you see is that Putin is talking about the post-unipolar order, the end of this fraud of the rules-based order, and the emergence of a new strategic architecture, which takes as its fundamental concern the benefit of the other, which is, of course, in the tradition of what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about with the Council of Florence, the intervention of Nicholas of Cusa, and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, which was based explicitly on this Christian principle of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That defines a complete shift away from the dictatorship of the unipolar order. Now, we'll take a look at another case study, the European Council Summit, which took place over the last couple of days. There's a great deal of hoopla about Ukraine in this. Would Ukraine be brought into the European Union? Will there be more money from the European Union pledged to Ukraine? And what happened is that on the question of accession of Ukraine and Moldova to the European Union, that was voted in favor. And this led to a wild celebration. The idea that Ukraine would be brought into the European Union. But there are some problems with it. First of all, it's going to take a while. Secondly, this may be too costly for the European Union, whose member nations are all suffering from economic crises. The ability to work out problems on agricultural subsidies and all sorts of other things, plus the fact that Ukraine is in a war and may not survive the war, all of these things make this somewhat of a hollow victory. And it was only achieved by what people are generally calling a bribe given to Viktor Orban, that the EU released money that was being withheld from Hungary. And Orban walked out of the meeting, so he didn't vote against the accession of Ukraine, but later spoke against it afterwards. But the second issue shows the real problem. The idea of 50 billion euros to be given to Ukraine over the next 4 years to survive or to continue the current war, the NATO proxy war against Russia, that was blocked by Orban so that no vote took place. So the question is, with the aid blocked to Ukraine from the United States and from the European Union, what's going to happen to that country? Well, we could also ask the question, what's going to happen to the European Union? The popularity of the member governments are collapsing. The coalitions that represent the last elections are barely surviving. We saw the Wilders vote in the Netherlands. Here in Germany, what do we see? We see a complete collapse of what's called the traffic light coalition, the red, green, black coalition. The problem in Germany is that there's no way to get a budget compromise without the three parties, the Liberal Democrats or the Free Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens. They all have completely contrary views. How do you deal with a budget deficit? Well, the Constitution of Germany has this debt break, which says you cannot go into debt beyond a certain level of GDP. And they're way above that now. So the question is, will the Social Democrats allow cuts in social welfare programs? Will the Greens allow cuts in the so-called transition to green economy, which, by the way, is a complete disaster because Germany's energy bills are going through the roof, corporations are leaving, there's a deindustrialization. And will the Free Democrats allow an increase in taxes, which goes against their very essence, to provide funds for development? And what's missing in the whole discussion is how should a nation handle a debt problem? Merely cutting the budget, and this, by the way, should be thought about in terms of the United States, which has a larger deficit problem than Germany. If you stop spending, you cut off the future. The Hamiltonian system, the LaRouche's American system, depends on credit for physical economic advance, especially oriented towards science and technology, innovation, and infrastructure. But if you have a narrowly defined uh, debt brake or black zero policy of not allowing deficits to occur, where's the future come in? And this is why the situation in Germany is becoming hopeless. So, by just looking at these situations, we see on the one hand Putin dealing with these kinds of questions by addressing this move into a new global geometry, while we see the EU and the United States stuck in the unipolar order of war, permanent austerity economies, central bank dictatorship, and no exit strategy from this collapse. This is the City of London geopolitical doctrine that dominates the discussion. And that is why they don't allow you to see this underlying dynamic which is emerging. So the options are either we go along with the proposals and fight for the proposal of Helga Zepp-LaRouche of a new strategic and development architecture for the world, or we end up with permanent war, permanent depression. And that's the choice facing people in the United States and Western Europe and the whole world. Much of the world has already decided, in particular the global South, to go ahead into a new order, breaking away from this order of war and austerity. What will happen in the United States and Western Europe? It's not clear. It's largely going to depend on what you decide to do in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks a lot, Harley. And we will be talking more with all of you who are listening about what it is you need to do. Right now, what I want to do is to introduce former CIA officer and State Department counterterrorism expert Larry Johnson. Now, Larry was recently in Moscow at a conference there, and we're happy that he's here today with us. He won't only be talking about that conference, of course, but his own view and observations of what is also happening and has been transpiring recently, including what Vladimir Putin had to say over the past week. Larry, welcome back and welcome here. I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that.
There we go. Great.
So, sound. I was trying not to make noise before.
Yeah.
I was invited along with a group of other, I think, sort of notable podcasters and bloggers to the International Russophile Movement. It's a conference organization was set up last March in conjunction with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with private sector individuals in Russia trying to counter the anti-Russian hysteria, which is so prominent in both the United States and Europe. So this was a small gathering. Alistair Crook was there, Pepe Escobar, Ava Bartlett, Michael Tracy. It was chaired by Dimitri Simes. Dimitri has a rather interesting history, having fled to the United States in 1972 from the Soviet Union in order to find freedom because he was being politically persecuted for his beliefs back then, became an American citizen, and had the misfortune, he found out in 2015, to become an advisor to the Trump campaign on foreign policy matters, particularly with respect to Russia, Ukraine, the former Eastern European countries that were under Soviet control. Trump, this is one of those rare examples where Donald Trump actually selected somebody who knew what they were doing and was competent. But Dmitry also learned the sad lesson, no good deed goes unpunished. He was subsequently embroiled in the whole fabricated Russiagate and faced possible criminal charges and had his world turned completely upside down. He has now gone back to Russia because there is more freedom, more respect for individual human rights in Russia than is the case in the United States today. And so just the story of Dimitri Simes sort of embodies the transformation that's underway in the world. We had a chance to speak with a very senior member. I'll just describe it as the Russian government. We were asked to, protect the person's identity. The individual made it very clear that the relations between the United States and Russia are at the lowest point ever in its history. That even during the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of the other events that marked, conflict between the United States and then Soviet Union, at no point was the United States political leadership, diplomats, or members of Congress routinely referring to Russia as an enemy. We are doing that now, and the Russians have taken note of that. They don't dismiss that as just loose talk without any substance. They believe it reflects a genuine intent on the part of the United States, excuse me, to attack Russia, destroy Russia. And so they are prepared to respond, to defend themselves. And it's, the United States is making a very grave error by both misunderstanding the transformation that has taken place in Russia and underestimating, disparaging Russia at every opportunity. Describing it, as John McCain did, as a country masquerading as a gas station. Just an incredibly stupid thing to say, because it doesn't even begin to reflect the reality of what Russia is. Nobody, very few know, and I keep bringing it up, it was Russia who was the only country that had functioning rockets capable of carrying U.S. astronauts to the space station for a period of about 20 years. It wasn't until Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos popped up. NASA still hasn't been able to work out that problem. And yet, with that technological skill in terms of space travel, we still continue to insist that Russia's economy is broken, that its people are a bunch of drunken louts, that its military is weak, unprepared, poorly led, and that they're having to scavenge from washing machines and refrigerators for computer chips just to be able to field a couple of rockets. It's all ludicrous. And this government official made it very clear that if push comes to shove, Russia will be prepared to destroy the United States and can do it. That's the thing Americans don't appreciate, that Russia's advances in air defense systems have given it the capability to have a credible means of defeating a significant number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, etc. The United States has no such defense. Russia has upgraded its defense forces in response to unilateral moves by the United States to both withdraw from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty. George Bush did that in 2002. And then the other nuclear agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, that was abrogated by Donald Trump. And this one official did mention to us that the person was present when John Bolton visited the Russians and told the Russians that the reason the United States was doing that was had nothing to do with Russia. It was all about China. We had to be ready to fight China. So this, the United States has been living this fantasy life that we are the rule maker. We're following the old golden rule. Those with the gold make the rules. And have kept insisting that we are in charge of this international rules-based order, but we're the ones that get to make up those rules. And as Harley noted in his remarks, and Dennis as well has said in the past, those rules are very flexible. So, for example, we're really strongly against countries like Russia invading countries like Ukraine. That's wrong. But it's okay for the United States to do it when it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Vietnam, run down the list. The transformation that I think that's really underway right now in the world is a growing intolerance of American hypocrisy. The world is basically fed up with our bullshit. They recognize that we have one standard for us, another standard for everybody else. The age of American diplomacy, it sort of metaphorically died well before Henry Kissinger, but let's put Henry Kissinger's death as sort of a bookend marking the end of a diplomatic era. Now, I'm not ignoring Kissinger's role with war crimes and other things, but he did have his talents as a diplomat. He was not just a one-note Charlie. But the United States has now evolved that our only two responses are we're going to impose sanctions, economic sanctions, legal sanctions, or we're going to go and we will invade you militarily. We have no third road. And the really interesting thing about the Russian special military operation, and it is a special military operation, it's not a full-blown war. Full-blown war looks like what Israel's doing in Gaza. That's not what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But in the course of the last 22 months, the Russians have awakened and realized they don't need the United States. They don't need Europe. They have everything they need domestically in terms of resources to run their industry. They have plenty of well-educated, better educated people than are in the West, highly intelligent. And they've really come into their own. I dealt with Soviet diplomats back in 1980, 81, during a time when I was teaching at the American University. And at that time, the Soviets displayed outwardly great inferiority complex, insecurity. And I'm sure you all have had the experience of dealing with somebody that's, has an inferiority complex. They're always overcompensating by bragging, saying, man, I did this great, and I am so good, and I am so tough. And the exact opposite is true. That's not what you're seeing. And as I think as both Dennis and Harley noted, and Harley particularly focusing on Putin's speech, look at the image that Putin projected. He wasn't looking at a teleprompter. He didn't have to consult notes to figure out, who's this person I need to call on. He did it all extemporaneously. He was calm, confident. The Russians now are a different animal. I would say in some aspects, a more dangerous animal, because they are confident about who they are, what they can do. And that confidence has grown in the course of this war, this proxy war that NATO sought to fight with and against Russia in hopes of destroying the Russian political leadership, in hopes of basically being able to rape Russia of its natural resources. And it's blown up on them. And instead of Russia crumbling, Russia has defeated not just Ukraine. The Ukrainian army represented the second largest de facto army in NATO after the United States, with Turkey being number 3. Relations with Turkey within NATO are already uneasy, and I don't think Turkey really can be relied upon going forward for NATO. So NATO's in a real pickle. They've sent their best equipment, and Russia's destroyed it easily. Russia controls the air. Russia has air defense systems. Ukraine does not any that work effectively. And so Russia all of a sudden is recognizing it doesn't have to surrender anything to the West in negotiations. It's going to be just the opposite. It's going to make the demands. And if its demands aren't met, so be it. It will pursue its interests on its own. And it will be doing so with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the South Africans, with the Brazilians. The age of U.S. global dominance is coming to an end.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, for your sober assessment. And you're going to get some questions. We'll be going to you right after we get to our next presenter. You're definitely going to get some questions on
Okay.
that. Uh,
All right.
Mike Robinson from UK Column is also here with us today. We rely on Mike not to make the United States look good, but merely to remind Americans that what goes on day to day in the British Empire is even worse, and often the precursor to what you'll see happen here next. Already, in hearing what Larry said about Russiagate, I know that Mike already has a bit of a surprise for some Americans, among others, about what he's going to say about that. So, Mike, welcome. Take it away.
Thanks, Dennis. Harley mentioned that Israel is a colonial project. Of course, originally it's a British colonial project. So I just wanted to begin by bringing everybody up to date with the state of the British colonial project. So just a few months before October the 7th, James Cleverly, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, he's now Home Secretary, met with Eli Cohen to sign an agreement to deepen Britain's relationship with Israel. And so I just want to run through very briefly a couple of the points and just to give you an idea of the scope. So they call this the 2030 Roadmap for UK-Israeli bilateral relations. And they're talking about it building on 75 years of close relations and shared commitments to tackle the scourge of anti-Semitism. So they, of course, were mainly focused on Iran. But just to give an idea of the scope of this was the main headline topics. So diplomacy, defense and security, economy, cyber, come on to cyber in a second, science, technology, climate, health, development, and of course, being the West, gender. This is a key thing these days. So just to put a bit of detail on that, they said with respect to Iran, we work closely to counter the current threat from Iran, including the Republican Guard. We will work to ensure Iran never has nuclear weapon capabilities. We'll seek to counter Iran's destabilizing regional activity, including weapons transfers conducted either by itself or through proxies, and will confront the threat posed to us both domestically, that's both Britain and Israel. They announced the Britain-Israel Investment Group that would partner on joint technology projects both in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. Capacity building and the provision of technical expertise that is going to promote and demonstrate the benefits of cooperation with Israel and so on. Drawing them closer, this is the Middle East and Southeast Asia, drawing them closer into the orbit of free market economies. And of course, that means British Wall Street free market economies. And of course, in line with that, we've seen the likes of this announcement at the G20 US, India, Saudi, EU unveiling alternative to the Belt and Road. So this is the big project, which of course goes right through perhaps North Gaza, which maybe is one reason why it's being flattened at the moment. But getting back to this then, they talked about increasing threats in cyberspace. They needed to cooperate on cyber issues. And of course, the pressure on China has been increasing in the UK, and China has been told that they must no longer sell their electronics into the UK for telecoms networks. And the main reason for this is because telecoms networks in the UK are now becoming dual use, so both civilian and military purpose. So military and intelligence communications going across the 5G network. So here is the National Crime Agency, Cybersecurity Agency, Huawei advice, what you need to know now. So why is Huawei being removed from UK 5G networks and other telecoms networks? Well, it's because of the risk, according to the British government, of Chinese spying on telecommunications networks in the UK. But here's the thing, because for many, many years, and this is going back to 2015, this is Francis Maude, who was the Cabinet Office Minister at the time. He has long admired the Israeli startup nation, which has become home to more startups per capita than any other country. And one of the main agencies in Israel, which is creating these startups, is Unit 8200, which is the Israeli equivalent of GCHQ or the NSA. And they have created a whole host of organizations, Checkpoint being one of them. Well, Checkpoint provides lots of network infrastructure, mainly firewall infrastructure into many, many places. We have other organizations like Adallam, who run cloud infrastructure. We have this organization, NSO Group, which, of course, is famous for the Pegasus spyware, which, once installed on your mobile phone, effectively seems to turn that into a bug for the intelligence agencies. And the relationship between Britain and the British intelligence agencies and Unit 8200, plus British universities and so on, is extremely close. So the question is, has Chinese infrastructure been removed from the telecoms networks because that could not be used by Western agencies to spy on telecoms traffic in the West? Or is it, well, I believe that's the main reason for it. Maybe Larry will have some comment to make on that later on. But coming back to this, then bilateral cooperation in clean tech, because we've got to make sure we deal with the challenges of climate change and also life sciences. But they were talking about funding 6 collaborative research projects via BIRACs. And of course, this project is run by another great British soft power organization, the British Council. So this was a joint thing between the British Council and the British Embassy in Israel. So the connection's extremely close. And of course, they're guided by their desire to strengthen relations in a whole range of other areas, including culture, arts, media, education. So extremely tightly bound now. And this means that naturally, the UK is fully supportive of Israel and what is going on in Gaza at the moment. What the UK is not supportive of course, as with the US, is Russia and China. And we saw that in the Security Council over the last couple of weeks, as the Security Council has attempted to bring through some resolutions to call for a ceasefire, to demand a ceasefire in Gaza. And of course, the country that has been using its veto in the last couple of weeks has been the United States. So there's the Deputy Permanent Representative there making his Nazi salute as he was issuing the veto for the most recent effort to bring a ceasefire in Gaza, and looking very sullen. On the left-hand side, there is the UK's Permanent Representative. Now, here's the issue. The question is, was the situation in Israel being taken advantage of here? And I suspect it has been, to some degree at least, because Britain in particular has been pushing extremely hard for UN Security Council reform. And the reason for this is that Britain is absolutely disgusted with Russia and China using its veto to prevent the UK and the United States from doing whatever it likes to other countries. So just a couple of days ago, James Kariuki, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative for the United Kingdom, made this statement about Security Council reform. He said, "The UK believes the Council must be reformed. We support permanent African representation. Of course, that would be Commonwealth countries and therefore British aligned representation, and the addition of new permanent seats for Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan. Turning to the veto, it's a heavy responsibility to be used in the interests of securing the peace and security that people around the world seek, and the UN was established to provide." That is, of course, a total lie, because, as I've said, the UK and the US have been extremely critical of China and Russia's use of the veto in recent years. He said, "The United Kingdom has not used our veto since 1989. We remain committed never to vote against a credible draft resolution on preventing or ending a mass atrocity." And the reason, of course, that he says that with a straight face is because it's the United States that uses its veto if necessary, as it did the other day or over the last couple of weeks. So they're encouraging member states to go along with Britain's plans for reform of the Security Council. I think this is the point that needs to be made here. Russia and China have used their veto to prevent war in the last number of years. On the other hand, the USA has used its veto to prevent peace, and I think that is the key point here. Now, just to move on very briefly, Dennis asked me to bring everybody up to date with the surveillance situation. And we've talked about the UK and surveillance in the UK over the last couple of times I've been on the programme. Now, the most recent news on this, the Daily Mail had an article telling us all that the Royal Air Force intelligence officers have now joined Whitehall and the UK military in spying on UK citizens, including David Davis, who's a member of Parliament, and Peter Hitchens, who's a journalist. And of course, that should come as no surprise to anybody who's been paying attention, because as we've been pointing out quite a lot over the last number of years, the censorship network and therefore the surveillance network that the UK government has built is quite amazing, with Rapid Response Unit in the Cabinet Office surveilling people and what they're talking about on social media, the National Security Communications Team doing the same, 77th Brigade doing the same, the FCDO, that's the Foreign Office's Counter-Disinformation Team, doing the same. We've got a Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport Counter-Disinformation Unit doing the same, and so on. And now we have apparently the Royal Air Force doing the same. And the question is, where did this come from? And it came from a Defence and Security Review, the National Security Capability Review, which fed into the Defence and Security Review. And they launched what they called the Fusion Doctrine at that time, which they described as building a culture of common purpose across government departments to build a whole of government approach. But in fact, that has developed since 2018 when that was published, and it has now become effectively government intelligence agencies, the military, the police, the media, that's the mainstream media, social media platforms, NGOs, think tanks, various influencers on social media, all working together to make sure that not only is the general public surveilled as they use social media and they share information and so on, but to try to counter what is described as disinformation. But the interesting aspect of this is this merger apparently between and the increasing militarization of what have been up until now civilian institutions. And this idea of merging military and civilian is something that I think we saw originally at the European Defence Matters Conference, I think in 2018, if I remember rightly, at the European Defence Agency, and that's Jens Stoltenberg from NATO and the then EU, you might call her Foreign Minister, Federica Mogherini. She was that role at that time. And at that particular meeting, she was absolutely calling for the merging of military and policing, civilian policing functions, but much broader as that conversation went on. And we saw that happening during lockdown, for example, with just one example, Dominic Raab, who was Foreign Secretary at that time, talking about British Armed Forces working side by side with National Health Service staff. This was during lockdown, and really people getting used to military and civilian staff working together. But there is a doctrine in the UK for this, and it's called MACA. So this is military aid to civil authorities, and it's something that has been developed over the last couple of years. The ability of civil authorities, such as local authorities and the police, to respond to a wide range of potential crises, being strengthened by the military getting involved. And they say that to further improve effectiveness of existing military support, are going to strengthen central government's crisis management capability. This will bring together civil servants and police with new permanently based defence specialists in the Cabinet Office. And so we are seeing this increasing militarization of what have been traditionally absolutely civil authorities in the UK. Now, we just wanted to talk a little bit about Russia, and Larry was talking about um, the anti-Russia sentiment that has been expressed in the United States. Of course, this has been absolutely a key part of the narrative, the political narrative in the UK for the last goodness knows how many years. But I think if you will remember, a number of years ago, an organization being created called the Integrity Initiative, which turned out to be a network of journalists and think tankers and NGO personnel and so on, all pushing an anti-Russian narrative and demonizing Russia in the minds of UK, European, and United States members of the public. And of course, subsequent to that, then we had the Russiagate situation in the United States with Donald Trump. Well, we now have a new foreign minister in the UK. It is a former prime minister, David Cameron. He's been brought back because the UK government is in a state of slow collapse at this point in time. And he had something to say about Russia a couple of days ago.
Today I'm in Washington having meetings with my counterparts in the US administration, but I can also announce today that we are sanctioning 2 individuals connected to the Russian intelligence agency, the FSB, for trying to interfere in our democracy. We've always known that Russia tries to do this, but today we're taking the extra step of issuing those sanctions and naming the individuals. This is unacceptable behavior. This is something that shouldn't take place. And so we're naming the individuals to call Russia out to say, we know what you're doing, and it has to stop.
So that's what they were. That was David Cameron's narrative. Now, the issue of Russians interfering in British democracy is something that they have been pushing. This is the National Security Centre. Russian FSB cyber actor Star Blizzard continues worldwide spearphishing campaigns, and they were talking about this being particularly focused on UK members of parliament and so on. So they accused them of targeting parliamentarians from multiple political parties from at least 2015 to this year. They talked about the hack of UK-US trade documents that were leaked ahead of the 2019 general election. They talked about the 2018 hack of the Institute for Statecraft. This was the hack which resulted in the documents being published that exposed the Integrity Initiative, which was absolutely designed to demonize Russia in the minds of people in the West. They talked about a more recent hack of the Institute for Statecraft founder, Christopher Donnelly, whose account was compromised in December 2021. That was his email account. And many of his emails were published. And the targeting of universities, journalists, public sector, non-government organizations, and other civil society organizations, many of whom play a key role in UK democracy. Now, it was us at the UK column that broke the story of the Integrity Initiative and the fact that they were apparently a front organization because they claimed to be operating out of this mill building in Scotland, which in fact is derelict and half demolished. So that was part of their demise, really, because that resulted then in a charity commission, which is the charities regulator in the UK, investigation of the organisation. And so the whole operation subsequently was forced to shut down. But we should remember who some of the key faces were and remain in the whole Russiagate thing in the United States and now in the UK. So we can call this Russiagate UK because this is clearly the direction of travel. And we should remember Christopher Steele and Richard Dearlove, who are absolutely at the forefront of now having failed effectively with Russiagate. They are now pushing as hard as they can on the anti-China rhetoric and particularly the lab leak narrative that China was responsible for creating COVID-19 and for launching it on the world as a bioweapon. But we should not forget Christopher Steele because, as we mentioned, he was involved with the Trump dossier. He was involved with the providing evidence for the UK Parliament's Russia report. He was also very much involved in providing documentation for the Huawei dossier, which resulted in Huawei being removed from UK telecoms infrastructure, and so on. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of those faces and and make the point that exactly the same type of narrative is being faced here in the UK as well. And just to finish off, I just want to highlight two things that are on the UK Column website at the moment. One is this, because one of the key spooks here alongside Dearlove and Christopher Steele is a guy called Pablo Miller, who is the handler for Sergei Skripal. If you remember, Sergei Skripal was the man who was allegedly poisoned with his daughter by Novichok, by Putin or Putin's operatives in the UK. And it was a complete fake story. But anyway, this article looks into Pablo Miller and the types of people that he has been associating with. And the other thing that I just want to, if we just end with Israel where we began, I recently spoke to Cliff Kirikoff on the origins of Christian Zionism, of course, originating in the United Kingdom. So if anybody hasn't seen that, it's worth having a look at, and I think it has opened a lot of people's eyes over here. So that's what I have for you, Dennis.
Thank you, Mike. You've done your usual job with Alfred Hitchcock-like storyboard efficiency. Okay, and I think we've got at this point we are going to bring everybody up on the screen. Now I've got questions, but I want to first of all ask Harley and Larry if any comments you'd like to make, either in response to what you heard from Mike or in general. So Harley, let's start with you.
Well, as usual, Mike gave us quite a bit of material there, and I think it's quite significant for people to not forget the role of the British. But I want to say something about Larry's report, because I think this should be circulated. What he said should be circulated in Germany widely, because in Germany, the defense minister, Pistorius, has called for a massive increase in German military preparedness. He said Germany must become war ready. Why? Because he's predicting that there will be a Russian war against NATO in the near future. Now, many people in Germany actually seem to believe this. And it's largely because they're being lied to repeatedly about what is Russia, what is the Ukraine war about. They forget that Merkel told one of the biggest lies when it came to the Minsk Accord, that she admitted that they had no intention of solving the problem in the Donbass, but they did it to give Ukraine more time to build up. So I think this report from Larry on what's actually going on in Russia is extremely important, and I think we really need to get it out to the poor Germans who seem to forget that the Russians have a very good memory of German tanks crossing Ukraine to go into Russia during World War II.
Actually, I think a lot of people have a good memory of that. Larry, any comment at all on anything actually that you're thinking?
A couple of points I didn't emphasize and maybe should bring up. This perception of Russia as a police state, as an authoritarian place, what nonsense! During my time in Moscow, it was so obvious to me that I didn't even think to comment on it. And what was obvious was I didn't see any police. And people say, "Oh, well, there you do. They had you under surveillance." No, look, I've been trained in counter surveillance. I've run counter surveillance classes for journalists in Eastern Europe. We actually ran them out of Lord's Cricket Ground in London. There was no surveillance. There was no cop on every street corner at all. They were very, very rare things to see. And I drove all over the city. You did not see you didn't even see a police presence of any consequence anywhere in Moscow. It's one of the, it probably is about, it's like what I experience here in Sarasota, Florida, as far as, you rarely see police hanging out. And that's because everything's calm, everything's good. The animus towards Russia, I believe, is primarily driven by the cultural differences between the woke West and the rebirthed religious orientation of the Russians. 75% of the Russians are practicing Christians of the Russian Orthodox version. And yet Russia has done something pretty unique in the world, that even though they are a dominant Christian nation, they found a way to live peacefully, cordially with Muslim citizens and people of other religious faiths. There is not any kind of sectarian strife that I perceived or could discern. And at the heart of what Russia is doing is they're rejecting the blatant homosexual agenda that is dominating in the West. I mean, it's I'm sure that they were horrified watching the movie that's circulating now on the internet of the Senate staffer of Ben Cardin having homosexual relations on a conference table, Senate Judiciary hearing room. I mean, that becomes emblematic of what America has become. And the Russians aren't having any part of it. They passed a law against organized LGBTQ movements. They've made it very clear. If you are homosexual, what you do in the privacy of your bedroom is your business. It will not be the state's business. But if you bring it out into public and try to organize and insist that that the state must embrace your point of view, then you'll have problems. And I find that there are, I believe, a lot of Americans who would actually welcome that point of view. But it just goes to illustrate this is not just an this is let's call it a spiritual ideological division that does separate Russia from the woke West.
Is a question that I have that I want to pose. There are a couple questions that we've also received, but let me start with something that I was intrigued to ask Mike about, and that is your discussion about the Israel as the heaven for startups. In the interface between civilian and military intelligence capabilities. It was the Israeli startup nation, is I think the term that was used. Now, the premise, you also hypothesized that the real issue with Chinese intelligence equipment is that it could not be appropriated by Western intelligence agencies so easily to basically conduct or to be integrated into the universal surveillance already going on in various of the Western nations. Larry just made the point he made concerning the police state matter. And while I don't want to keep in this area, the reason I'm bringing it up is because many people have talked about whether or not one of the elements of the past 2 months of the campaign by the IDF involves experimentation in various ways with military equipment of various types, as well as reorganization. Obviously, I mean, they're reorganizing Gaza and Palestine clearly. So I just want to know if there's anything you'd like to say further about British involvement, both in terms of the ongoing operations, but also the deeper level of this civilian military interface.
Well, look, the first thing to say is we're not talking about intelligence equipment. We're talking about telecommunications equipment. So China has done very well, or Huawei has done very well in getting their kit bought by British domestic telecoms companies. And at some point, the British government said, this has got to stop, or at least there was a lot of agitating from outside the British government about it, and mainly coming from the likes of Dearlove and that type of source. And they said Huawei has got to be removed from the Huawei equipment has got to be removed from UK's telecommunications infrastructure, civilian telecommunications infrastructure we're talking about here. And the UK government sort of stalled on that a little bit, but they eventually came round to the idea, and they now have banned Huawei from taking any further part in UK's. And the main reason for that is that over the last 5-6 years, the military doctrine here has changed somewhat to be one of, as I said, the term that they use is dual use. So they are wanting to use, so the UK government, for example, bought an entire satellite, commercial satellite company called OneWeb, which is supposedly in competition with Elon Musk's Starlink. And they have bought that. This is low Earth orbit communication satellites for internet communications, but they want to dual use that infrastructure for defense purposes and intelligence agency purposes as well. And the same with the 5G network in the UK. And so that's why they have now decided to remove Huawei from that. Because they view China as an enemy, and that they don't trust China, that China won't be hoovering up all kinds of data if they have their gear on the telecoms network. And I'm simply interested about the fact that Israeli companies like Checkpoint and others are everywhere on our domestic civilian IT infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure, and so on. And we're not concerned about that. And of course, that's because we are so closely tied to Israel. And many, this is something that isn't UK centric either. Israeli companies' infrastructure in the United States, everywhere in the United States as well. So I just wanted to clarify that this isn't intelligence equipment. It is standard telecoms gear, which is actually probably in many cases better than what we have in the West. So that was the point there.
Okay. All right. Very good. Harley, there's a question that we did get, which I'm going to throw to you. It's from Nina. She's asking, my question is why George Soros Rothschild is the way she puts it, supports the Palestinians and their NGO. I'm not sure. That means George Soros' non-governmental organization, I suppose.
I really don't know the answer to that. Soros, it tends to be wherever there can be trouble stirred up. He's at the center of that repeatedly. I'm not sure about his relationship with the Palestinians, but I would be highly suspicious if I were a Palestinian of doing anything with George Soros. Soros's operations are integrated heavily into Anglo-American intelligence. But he also has a certain amount of capability because of the money that he can throw into things. So I really don't know the answer to that. I suspect if there is something there, that it's something that should be watched very closely.
Okay, Larry, back to you for a minute. And this is on what you had to say. Well, you alluded to this issue of Christianity in Russia, which caused a certain surprise by some people. But but I believe you had some contact with some members of the Russian Orthodox Church when you were over.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Can you just say something about so people can wrap their head around the real Russia as opposed to what mythology they may have in their mind about how it operates today?
Yeah, I think the traditional Western mythology that's embraced is that Russia is still the Soviet Union. It's still a communist country. It's anti-religious. It's keen on destroying. It's godless, like godless communists. So what's happened is, going back to 1991, as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian Orthodox Christians sort of emerged from underground. They were like, larvae that had been in hibernation. They had been hiding out, but they maintained their faith. It was true in the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution. They tried to destroy, and did destroy, many Russian Orthodox churches, in particular the Sertensky Monastery, which is just a little bit east of the Kremlin. It's within sight of Lubyanka prison, and it was the oldest monastery church in Moscow, established 1387. So the original church is still standing. That was not destroyed. But the church that had been built up was burnt to the ground. And 1991, they jumped right on it, rebuilt it. Beautiful place, incredible acoustics. And it's right now, it's estimated that 75% of the Russian population are practicing Russian Orthodox Christians, including Vladimir Putin. I ran into 3 American expats who have all migrated or immigrated to Russia from the United States as clergy. One was a subdeacon, another was a deacon, and in the process of becoming a priest, one was a priest. And they were all very enthusiastic with their choice. One gentleman mentioned, he said, I had 8 kids, and I was not going to subject them to this the sexual perversions that are being foisted upon children in elementary school. And he said, we don't have that here. Here they learn to read, they learn to speak other languages, they learn a novel concept that, traditional education. So this is not a sham thing. In fact, there's a lot of video footage out in particularly on Telegram of frontline Russian units receiving communion, being baptized with the Russian Orthodox clergy right out there on the front line. And you contrast that with what's taking place in Ukraine. There is a satanic cult there, and they have attacked the Russian Orthodox Church and tried to replace it with a heretical organization. But they are locking up priests. They're doing to the Russian Orthodox priests exactly what the communists did, the Bolsheviks did in 1921, 1922. So it's a remarkable revolution. It's genuine. It's widespread. And the West would be fools not to take note of it.
Mm-hmm. Harley, there's been a comparison made between the way that Putin approached his 4-hour dialogue, really, with the Russian population and with the press. He combined these things. He usually does them separately, put them together. And the press was actually from all over the world. So it was more sort of like the world press looking over the shoulder of Putin as he talked to the Russian people. And Larry already mentioned, Putin didn't even have an iPad. He had a notepad. He was simply there, sitting there writing things down and then responding. So this has been compared to Roosevelt's fireside chat. That it's sort of another take on that same approach. What do you think about that as a comparison, and what do you think it means that obviously this is also a demonstration of leadership that is available and accessible for anybody to judge that watches it?
Well, I heard the BBC report on this, where what they said is that this is Putin trying to spin his re-election campaign, and that's why he did it, and it was all scripted and so on. Typical British BBC slander. What struck me was that the people who were asking questions weren't just simply deferential to Putin. Some of them put hard questions to him. There was a veteran who said, look, I had to go to the front lines to get care. Can you do something about this? There was a woman who talked about the price of eggs. And Putin took a couple of notes and he said, this is related to some of the problems they have with getting enough vaccines. So what was remarkable was that he was talking to people the way you would like to see a leader talk to people. And that's the comparison with FDR, where FDR got on the radio and spoke to people as someone who's trying to help them solve problems, as opposed to someone dictating a line. And the line against Russia, authoritarian. This is the Atlantic Council dictatorship, the authoritarian dictatorship versus democracy. I don't think there's a country in the world right now in the West, or a leader in the West, who can have that kind of dialogue with people, especially when there are people bringing up real problems. So I think it was exemplary. Um, it's what did come through, besides the line of the BBC that they're trying to spin these things. There wasn't spin going on. There were people who brought up real problems, real concern, but they did it expecting that Putin would take their concerns seriously. And from what you can see, he did. So I would say the analogy to the FDR fireside chat uh, does have some merit, but I think it really does reflect a commitment to open what Larry's saying, open government, not a secret government manipulating the process behind the scene.
Yeah, one of the toughest questions he took was from the kids down in Crimea in the gym.
Oh,
They definitely wanted an answer. They needed a new gym. And
yeah,
that one was an interesting thing because they had cut the money, as he said, we've got to get back to it. So uh, it's hard to see that that was scripted. Certainly their reaction to him was not scripted. They really wanted their gym. Um,
yeah.
back to you for a minute, Mike. And this is about your reference to the European Defense Matters Conference of 2018. Now, here's the reason for the interest in this. I mean, clearly, this is after, of course, the Maidan coup, but it's a conference where you seem to be indicating this military aid to civil authorities was one of the things that you, I believe, referenced with respect to that. Why did you pick that as a key intervention or key moment? And what do you think it meant in terms of NATO's uh, sort of approach to not only Russia, but conflict in the aftermath of that conference?
The only reason I brought that up was because that was the first time that I personally saw that being discussed openly, and it was being discussed openly. We were watching very closely what the European Union and NATO were doing together, because at that time there was quite a push towards the European Union creating its own military capability. Um, so we were watching those types of conferences to see what they were talking about, and so the only reason I bring that up is because that was the first time we saw it. But look, these sort of policy areas never appear in one place. So the EU's been talking about it, UK's been talking about it. I'm sure it's been discussed in the United States as well. But if you remember back to one of my earlier presentations, the the meeting of the G7 just the year prior to that, 2017, I think it was, when Theresa May brought this idea of the rapid response mechanism, this idea that we have common policies, common goals, common narratives, and that those are communicated, at the same time with the same types of language, across all the Western countries. So there was nothing. I wasn't focusing on that for any other particular reason. At that time, the relationship between Jens Stoltenberg and Federica Mogherini seemed to be extremely close. And although things seem to have moved back towards the direction of NATO since the Ukraine conflict, the EU still wants to develop its own capability, and its main focus seems to be Africa. And again, this is and we're talking about North Africa and the Sahel countries. I mentioned this before, and this is Belt and Road related again. So the EU sees that as their southern neighbourhood, their territory, and an area that isn't really traditionally NATO's playground. So they want to be able to intervene directly. And that was part and parcel of that sort of the development of that policy at that time.
Okay. There are some other matters to take up, but I understand that Ray McGovern has popped in. Is that the case? It is the case.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm so late.
It's okay, Ray. Ray McGovern, for anybody that doesn't know, 27 years, Central Intelligence Agency, general troublemaker, and has recently been involved in particular. There he is. This isn't a recent picture, but that tells you more or less his view of the present circumstance in Gaza, as well as his general take on the condition of American foreign policy. You happened, Ray, to show up exactly at the point that we had gotten a question, which I'm going to pose, which will give you a way to say many things. We've
Uh-oh.
been talking sort of generally about, the Putin 4 hour fireside chat variation. We've been talking about the Gaza situation. Mike Robinson has told us a lot of things about what's going on with in Great Britain, which of course is always in advance in the wrong direction to what's going on in the United States. But here's the question that was just came in and was just posed. Um, this is from Munasha, and he asks, "What is the significance of the 153 United Nations members' vote when Israel continually escalates its assault on civilian Palestine?" And what needs to be done to bring some power to that vote. And I decided to ask you that, even though you haven't said a word yet, so that whatever you're going to say, you sort of have that in your mind as something that's on the mind of a few people in our audience. So feel free to take up whatever you wish, but keep that in your head as your context.
Well, thanks, Dennis. And again, sorry I'm so late here. I just got off another interview. 193 members of the UN, 153 voting for a ceasefire, 10 against, if memory serves, of which you have, the Mariana Islands and other people that depend completely on the United States. So the shibboleth, the notion that Russia is isolated now because of all the things that have happened in Ukraine and the Middle East, is just the way around. Yes, just the other way around. You have the United States isolated and unable to really divorce itself from this uncommon marriage with Israel. I joined at the hip, as the United States and Tel Aviv are. So, what's the end result of this? Well, it shows the whole world what's going on here, and to the degree this genocide, and it's a textbook case of genocide, to the degree this genocide continues, the rest of the world's going to do something about it. And that's why I think even the Biden administration is a little worried about now, and they're making noises about, well, when you drop those bombs, make sure you tell all the civilians, go over here, don't kill so many civilians. Well, that's so transparently stupid. So what's going to happen? I don't know exactly, but I think it's just a matter of time before Hezbollah in the north, they're in southern Lebanon, and maybe others start to intervene in a more aggressive way. It's a little awkward, isn't it, that the little Yemen is the country that's causing the most problems here, interfering with shipping in the Red Sea and its approaches. So the big question will be whether the Israelis can be stopped before they continue the genocide for another week or two. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is the question. And what Putin said in his his long 4 hour Q&A 2 days ago supports the notion that he's riding high. He's waiting to see how many other people will line up with him against the U.S. and its policies, not only in the Middle East, but with respect to Ukraine as well.
I'm going to follow up with you about something which will allow us to get back into some things that Larry was saying, which will be more clear. as you take this up. As you probably heard, some of us all heard today about the Israeli Defense Forces killing 3 of their own soldiers, who I believe were sort of shot while escaping from Hamas in Gaza. One of them had a white flag or something resembling that, as best as they could. They had taken off their shirts so that the idea was, we don't have any weapons, and the Israelis shot him and killed him, or shoot at least 2 of them. I don't know if the third actually is dead or not. There's
Yeah, no,
something
he's dead.
called he is dead. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so there's something called blind rage, and I had said it in my opening that this is sort of a metaphor for how the present mass murder and displacement going on is got to end. That you've got a circumstance in which there's no principle of victory involved. There's just mere destruction. And Ray, you've talked before. This is a good time because, of course, this is sort of just a kind of a pre-Christmas, it's the Christmas season. Many people are looking for a ceasefire, and that's not going to happen. You've talked about the issue of metanoia before. Yes, different people have heard it, but we have a lot of new people who are now sort of around. I wonder if you could address this uh, this sickness, and how how policymakers should think about correcting a problem like this. I mean, obviously there's the churches and others, but what do you do if you're a policymaker and you're in this kind of circumstance?
Dennis, this is a difficult one because you have a sui generis type of situation in Washington. You have a rehabilitated president who can't find his way off a stage, can't string 2 sentences together without the teleprompter. You have a very volatile situation here. You have people who are afraid of losing the kind of equity they need to win the election coming up, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and people who have a personal stake in this. In other words, if Biden doesn't win or is not seen to be winning, as I've said before, he's in real trouble because if he doesn't win the election, then this new fellow who comes in could well put Biden, his son, Blinken, and Sullivan in prison for offenses demonstrably against the law. So what I'm saying here is that you mentioned the churches. Well, the churches cannot find their voice. This is not the first time in my life that they couldn't find their voice. I was alive for all of World War II. They couldn't find their voice for the first genocide against 6 million, if you will, Jews in Nazi Germany. So what's the idea here? The idea is that this time around, they still can't find their voice. Still can't find their voice. So what does that mean? That means it's up to us. It means it's up to Jewish voice for peace. It means for people who are gutsy enough, like Code Pink, to disrupt. Disruptive grace needs to be applied here. That's the kind of metanoia. Metanoia means to turn your whole approach around. Meta, adverb, noia, your nous, your mind, you turn your mind inside out and you approach things in a different way. Now, if you can't approach things in a different way when genocide is going on, well, then we're not worth too much. And when we talk about justice, which is really the basic concept for Yahweh of the Hebrew Scriptures, Jesus of the New, and the prophet, justice means showing mercy to the poor. That was the original concept. It means showing mercy to the poor, to preference to the poor. And so, if we can't muster the ability to do that during this coming season and say, look, we have to stop the carnage and we have to put our bodies into it. I mean, it's not enough just to make nice statements or write really, really clever articles. got to do something like was already happening with Jewish Voice for Peace, closing down highways, closing down this, that, or the other thing, just to show Joe Biden and his counselors there that they no longer rule the roost with the kind of support they've enjoyed up till now, and that if they have any, to be cynical about it, if they have no concept of justice, well, that's one thing. But if they consider that they're going to lose the election coming up, that might move them to action. Long way of saying it's up to us, in my view. There is never anyone else. It's just us. We've got to do what we've got to do.
I think perhaps in terms of shifting to that, talking about that for a minute, because that you reminded me of a conversation that just happened actually with Helga Sepp-LaRouche a little earlier. She's somewhat under the weather, but we were talking, and she said, we don't want people to in any way become comfortable with the image of the carnage that's going on. She said, just because it's not leading the headline today doesn't mean it's not happening. She said, of course, it's happening in several other places. It's happening in Sudan, it's happening in Congo, but what's happening in Gaza is something that no one can deny has been rejected by the majority of the world. And so, Harley, I don't know if you have anything that you have to say in response or in reflection to what Ray said.
Well,
Sort of.
yeah. Well, let me just add, it's worse than that. The difference here is that the U.S. is enabling this without U.S. arms, without our political support. Netanyahu couldn't do this. So unlike Sudan and other regions, we are responsible. We are co-belligerents or co-evildoers here in the kind of carnage that comes with genocide. And that's what's different here. We're citizens of the United States. The United States is the sine qua non, without which Israel could do these things. We have to stop it because it's on us. Sorry for being.
No. Thank you. Fine.
I would say what Ray is saying, just to emphasize it, it's complicity in genocide, and it's not just accepting it. The U.S. is probably the one country that could stop it by cutting off funds and arms. And I wrote a piece not too long ago about how Eisenhower intervened in 1956 in the Suez Crisis. There are a number of aspects to it, but what did he do? You had Britain, France, and Israel attacking Egypt when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And the British wanted the United States to join. And what Eisenhower did is he threatened to dump British bonds, which would have had a huge impact on Britain at the time because they would have had to use their dollars to buy back their bonds. And within a couple of days, the British pulled out. They got the Israelis to pull out a little bit later. But that's the kind of power that the United States still has. And the problem is that, is Biden capable of doing that? Well, I think Ray's point is we have to make sure there's such a strong outcry that it gets through to the political handlers of Biden that there's no way he'll win the election with Ukraine and Gaza around his neck. And I think that's the point here. It is up to the people to take a stand, and not just one day, but every single day do something that moves the situation.
I have something I want to direct Larry's attention to. If we can have the map of the Dnieper River for a minute. Larry, there's been a discussion that Alexander Mercouris, among others, have done. If we could have the detailed map now concerning the end game of the end game in Ukraine. You're putting the second map up? Thank you. Because this was just yesterday or the day before yesterday. Alexander Mercouris was making this reference that you're entering a situation around the war, which is, in his view, similar to the sort of thing that happened in Vietnam. Now, Kynan, are you able to point out the Dnieper River there? This was supposed to be highlighted So this doesn't work very well. Go if you don't have the highlighted map, go back to the other one. What McCord was saying was that all of the cities of Ukraine are along the river. Putin has made it clear that Odessa is a Russian city. He spoke about that during his dialogue, his 4-hour dialogue.
Right.
So, Larry, could you say something first, and then Ray, you may have a different view of what appears to be the circumstance there now militarily. I'm not talking about a total military analysis, but why would the Russian army going to that boundary? Why would that mean that the war was essentially over?
One of the photos I took while I was in my trip to Moscow last week was at the Novorossiya Museum, and it was from 1921. And it showed a heart with the arteries running out of the heart, and it was superimposed over the Donbass. And the message on the poster was, the Donbass was the heart of Russia, in that sense, not of Ukraine, but of Russia. This is not a new idea that has emerged, and the Dnieper represents a natural boundary that I'm certain Russia is going to. They will go up to the Dnieper. They will control all territory to the east of the Dnieper, and they will also control Kiev, because Kiev sits right on the Dnieper River. It's sort of like Kansas City. You got Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City, Kansas. Missouri River flows right down the middle of them. That's sort of Kiev, only a lot larger than Kansas City. Odessa sits to the west of the Dnieper, but as Putin made very clear in his 4-hour press conference, Odessa is Russian, and the Russians are not going to let it go. The entire diplomatic negotiating picture has changed from what it was a year ago, March. At the end of March of 2022, Russia was willing to make some territorial concessions in order to reach an agreement with Ukraine that would have prevented Ukraine from becoming part of NATO and will have eased the threat on Russia's borders. That's gone now. That's not coming back. Russia's going for the full Monty. They will take all territory up to and including the Dnieper, and then as well as Odessa, and maybe even go over into Moldova. The ability of Ukraine to continue to have a ready access to the Black Sea will be ended. And that'll be part of the military defeat that's coming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ray, any comment?
Well, I fear that Larry is right here, and what I'd like to just describe is what I call a missed opportunity. A year ago, well, actually 14 months ago, in October of last year, Putin, at the last 4-hour marathon Q&A, he was asked a very sly question by a Serbian correspondent. Said, Mr. Putin, I'm thinking of making a trip to Odessa in about 2 years from now. Should I apply for Ukrainian or for Russian visa? Clever, huh? I imagine that was staged, but I don't know for sure. Anyhow, Putin speaks extemporaneously. And he talked for a while, Odessa, a beautiful city. Catherine the Great founded it. It could be a Yabloko Razdora. Yabloko is apple. Razdor is discord. So go back to the Trojan War, if you will. It could be an apple of discord, or it could be a symbol of conflict resolution. I remember I made a note of that, okay? Now, what he said last year, October 27th to be precise, he said, we're ready to negotiate on this. It's true that the final word belongs to Washington, but it's very easy for them to send the appropriate signal to Kiev to seek a peaceful solution, and that will do it. End quote. So, talk about a broad hint. You know, I dare say that when Larry and I were working as analysts at the CIA, we would have jumped on this and made sure that our policymakers knew about this strange overture that came in this strange way. But it's real enough, okay? I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I'm not sure anybody had the guts to say, whoa, this might be an overture here. Maybe we ought to talk about this. Maybe the Russians are willing to go up to Odessa and say, look, um, let's make this not a Yabloko Razdora, but rather a conflict resolution start. Let's figure out a way to manage Odessa, maybe jointly, so the Ukraine can be a viable country or to have access to the sea. It wouldn't have to just end up as a farmland for the rest of Europe and the world. Let's see if we can work something out. Okay, there's precedent for that. Trieste after one of the world wars. So that was a broad hint. Whether it ever got to policymakers or not, I don't know. But if it did, they rejected it. So now, as Larry says quite rightly, here's Putin, not yesterday, but the day before yesterday, saying the southeastern part of Ukraine has always been Russian. It was incorporated by Russia as a result of wars with Turkey. Odessa is a Russian city. We know that. Everybody knows that. Okay. Now, that's a harder position, obviously. He didn't say it could be a symbol of conflict resolution. But I see some flexibility in the Russian stance still. He says, even day before yesterday, he said, we'd like to talk, we'd have a decent relationship with the United States, it's a major country. We're sensible people. So whether at this late stage, that offer made 14 months ago could be brought into play, it's probably against the odds that that's the case. But I think that if there were some enlightened response on the part of the West, that Putin would be able to say, well, all right, look, if we have a demilitarized zone to the west of the Dnieper, if we have this, if we have that, and the other thing, all right, let's manage Odessa jointly. And that could kind of facilitate what remains of Ukraine remaining a viable country. So that's maybe a pipe dream at this point. But my point is that was a missed chance. Whether it's foregone forever, I don't know. I think it should be tried, but it doesn't look like any flexibility of the kind that would be necessary in Washington is going to be forthcoming.
Put this back up so at the event that you have any comment, just so that it's clear. So there's the river, and there's Odessa. We see in the far south there, then Kherson, Kharkova, sort of all these names that people have heard. Zaporozhye, okay, of course Kiev. They're sort of all along. So this is sort of the industrial spine of Ukraine. Would that be appropriate to say about this, Larry?
Yeah, everything to the east of that river, and the Donbass. As you watch these battles that have been raging in places like Mariupol, in Bakhmut, now Avdiivka, massive plants, coke plant, steel plant. So this really was a manufacturing heartland. It wasn't just agriculture. It was an industrial capability that was very significant for Ukraine. It's gone. It's part of Russia now. And the mineral deposits that make Ukraine in the top 5 in the world in terms of natural resources and rare earth minerals, those also are located to the east of the Dnieper River. So this is devastating for Ukraine on a whole variety of fronts, militarily, economically, culturally.
Yeah. let's have that second image for a minute. I have a question for Ray, returning to it. So, so that big red circle, pretty big red circle, it shows us Odessa and the Black Sea, which I think everybody can see. Ray, you referenced Catherine the Great, or that Putin referenced Catherine the Great founding this city. Um, I'd like you to also perhaps tell people a little bit about, Catherine the Great and the League of Armed Neutrality, because Catherine the Great was one of the first allies of the United States, of the then emerging United States, fledgling United States, um, and had an idea about helping to defend it, uh, by kind of a passive militarism, if you might enlighten people about that.
Well, Catherine the Great reigned about the time of our revolution, United States Revolution. And she was a relatively enlightened person, and she expanded Russian territory down. She beat the Turks, uh, and established what Larry referred to as Novorossiya along the banks of the Black Sea. There was no real difference between Ukrainians and Russians at the time. They were Slavs, and Ukraine wasn't really in the picture at the time. Now, Catherine the Great has been a big uh, she's had statues erected, especially in Odessa. Okay, for those of you who have seen the Tyomkin, the movie made by Eisenstein, you ought to see it. It's an amazing sort of thing. Anyhow, uh, the big statue erected in honor of Ekaterina Velikaya, Catherine the Great, was still standing when Putin made that overture 14 months ago. Where is it now? Torn down. Okay. They finally tore it down, broke it into various pieces, put it in storage. So what the Ukrainians are trying to do is remove any vestige of their heritage, because their heritage is very, very thin when it comes to history. It's part of Russia's heritage. And when Larry explains where all the industry is, quite right there, okay? But right there in the middle, Kiev, that was the beginning of the Slavic nation, for God's sake. That was where the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarus finally got a language, for God's sake. 9th century AD. They didn't have a written language. It was brought to them by some Greek missionaries. They manufactured this language. And then this very, 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 very advanced oral tradition. They had poems like Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, okay? They had to memorize them. Now they could write them down. First thing they did was make their Bibles and their liturgies legible, and finally decided to join the what they decided to do is make themselves Christian, okay? And the way they did that was Vladimir the Great, okay? He was the knyaz, he was the prince in 10th century, okay? He said, all right, we're going to be Christians now. Everybody down to the Dnieper, we're going to be baptized, and then this will be good, okay? And then we can join Byzantium at the time and have all this kind of culture. Why was Kiev so rich? Because of the Dnieper. The Vikings, the people from Scandinavia, came down through the river system in Europe and down through the Dnieper down to Constantinople at the time, all right, and got very rich. So that's how the civilization that became Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine developed. And it didn't develop until the 8th and 9th and 10th century after Christ, okay? So just as a side thing here, they were behind the West. And not only that, but next thing you knew, 2 centuries later, Genghis Khan and his group came in, and they ruled Russia for 2 centuries and 40 years. Okay? No. So at the time when the West is coming out of the Dark Ages, right? We're finally coming into the Renaissance in the West. The Russians are already 2.5 centuries behind, okay? And long story short, they've been trying to catch up. And they are incredibly talented, gifted people. They caught up long before now, okay? And now, of course, the window to the west that Peter the Great constructed in 1700 or so, that has been shut, closed down by the West, uh, and the outlook is to the east. And yet, Putin is still saying, as he did 2 days ago, look, we want to negotiate with everyone. The United States is a major country. Certainly, we're open to talking with him and having a better relationship. I think that Putin, since he's probably going to be around for 6 more years, maybe 12 more years, we're lucky to have him, because if he were to be eased out or forced out or somehow, you get the guys who will say, look, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you're really dumb. You should have gone into Ukraine in 2014 and not let yourself be diddled by the West, by the French, by the Germans, by the US. You let yourself, look, we have all this carnage now. Several thousand Russians killed as well as 400,000 Ukrainians. It's all your fault. So this is the kind of hardliner is likely to come in if Putin is dislodged. So that's another part of all this. Putin is drawing on a heritage that is real enough and that every Russian appreciates, that, this is the heartland of what used to be Russia. History shows that Catherine the Great, Yekaterina Velikaya, was a big support not only to expanding Russia, but cultivating a decent relationship with the fledgling United States of America, as some of her successors, noticeably Alexander II, he helped Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, for God's sake. They've been friends. And then, of course, World War II, we were allies. How is this all forgotten so easily? Well, the media. That's how it's forgotten so easily.
Thank you very much, Ray. We're up on time, and I want to just I'll give people a chance to respond, say anything they'd like to say, and we'll begin to bring it to a close. Larry, I'm going to go to you first. I referenced something that Putin had said. Now, this, of course, is a translation, but concerning America. Said, we believe that the United States is an important and necessary country for the world. However, their absolutely imperial policy is hurting themselves. It's not even hurting us. It's hurting them first and foremost.
Yeah.
But then he said this, as soon as something changes domestically, this would establish the fundamental conditions that would allow them to respect others, to respect other countries, to seek compromise rather than use force and sanctions. I wanted to ask you this question because you were in Russia recently and you spoke to people in Russia. What's their view of the American problem? Is it coherent with Putin's view? And what do you think about the issue of a possible positive response by Russia to some domestic change in the United States?
Yeah, I think the Russians they're getting over the United States. If you recall, back in particular in the 1980s, I think was when the first McDonald's opened up in Moscow. My hotel was about 4 blocks from that, and it was mob back then because all things Western were seen as keen. Geez, Levi jeans, boy, that was a hot item. No, it's no longer the case. The Russians, I think, combination of perplexed, puzzled, mystified by the United States' open expression of hatred towards Russians, not just Putin, towards all things Russian, and to have such a perverse view of Russian life that that they imagine that everybody is taking care of nature's needs in an outhouse in the midst of winter, that they're deprived of toilet paper, they're using corn cobs. I mean, it's just it's absurd, it's nonsensical. So the Russians, they've turned away. The McDonald's, it's closed now. They're doing something else. There is no fascination with American brands. And what we've seen, and what Putin correctly noted, the United States has committed suicide in terms of its world position. from a leadership standpoint. And the culminating point, to use a term coined by Clausewitz, was the special military operation and the sanctions the West imposed in the wake of that. Because Washington and the rest of Europe genuinely believed that imposing those sanctions would crash the Russian economy, create domestic discord, force Putin from office, and then the West would be in a position where we could call the shots. The exact opposite happened. Strengthened Putin's hand, cut the Russian economy free of Western dependence so it could sort of grow on its own, develop new ties with countries in the global South that previously it may have shied away from. And in the process, you see the erosion of U.S. influence around the world. When China and Russia got together and convinced the Saudis to have a rapprochement with Iran, it brought an immediate end to the war on Yemen. And now look what little Yemen is doing, man. It's shutting down the Red Sea. So all the container ships that used to flow up in the Red Sea and go to Israel, they're not going now. And in the past, Yemen was involved with a war that was designed to be attacking Iran by proxy. So that's gone. Syria as well. The United States policy had been to isolate Syria. Let's shut them out. Well, whoops. The Arab League has now brought Bashar al-Assad back into the good graces of the Arab League and the Muslim nations as well. So the U.S. is now finding itself isolated, and the power of the U.S. dollar is not what it once was. We can no longer necessarily hold people hostage. In fact, the very act of confiscating Russia's money and freezing its assets that were held in U.S. dollars has made every other country in the world that has any kind of significant dollar cash say, wait a second, we can't trust these Americans anymore. So Putin rightly recognizes what's going on. The problem is I can't imagine a single politician in America standing up and calling for normalized relations with Russia. Anyone who would dare do that's going to be attacked as a puppet of the Kremlin, as a Putin, organ grinders monkey. It's dangerous, and I'm afraid it's going to take some sort of disaster, a military disaster in particular, on the part of the United States, for us to be able to come to our senses and recognize we need to be friends with Russia, not enemies.
Thanks, Larry. Mike, coming to you here. In the streets of London, we've been seeing very large demonstrations throughout several weeks, actually. We know that the government structure there is impossible, but you've been working with people like Vanessa Beeley and others, some of whom have been on our platform. And you yourself are indefatigable in this whole work of expose you've been doing. What do you think people are prepared to do there, or should be prepared to do, to keep the fight going, even in the face of these manipulations of the surveillance state? We're going to have another week, I think, at least, of demonstrations. I don't know what's happening there today or tomorrow, but any thoughts about that matter?
Going back to 2003, there were 1 million people came out to persuade Tony Blair not to invade Iraq. And subsequent to that, Blair ignored that demonstration. And unfortunately, at that time, people seemed to, they never really accepted that decision by Blair, but they didn't do anything about it. And what's interesting is that at this time, we've seen weekly demonstrations of people that are absolutely pro-Palestine. But among that crowd, and there've been huge crowds of tens of thousands of people in the streets of London, getting barely any recognition in the mainstream press at all. There have been efforts to turn those demonstrations violent, which have failed. And as in the United States, there have been Jewish voices in amongst those demonstrations. There have been separate pro-Israeli demonstrations, which have been much smaller. and they tend to happen on a Sunday, and there've been a couple of those. But every single week now, there have been pro-Palestine demonstrations, and the call of the people has been for a ceasefire. And the mainstream media, where they have reported it at all, have attempted to say that these are Islamic extremists, that they are pushing anti-Semitic narratives, that they're running around with calls from the river to the sea and ending Israel and all this kind of thing. I've been to these demonstrations, and I will acknowledge that there were some small numbers of placards saying those types of things, but 99% or greater of the placards were simply calling for a ceasefire. And everybody was extremely determined and extremely certain that the ceasefire is what they are requiring at this point in time. Now, the perhaps unfortunate thing is that we in the UK are going to be facing a general election in the next 12 to 18 months. And there is no question, I think, that the current government is going to fall and is going to be replaced by the Labour Party and Keir Starmer, who sadly is on the end of some puppet strings, with the puppeteer being Tony Blair. So if that Labour government becomes the next government, we will effectively have Tony Blair back as Prime Minister, which is perhaps a difficult situation. But the positive thing here is that there's a determination, there's a reinvigoration of the peace movement in the UK, and they're not going anywhere. And so whoever is thinking about running for the next government is going to have to deal with that somehow. And I think that is something that the momentum is not going to leave in 2024.
I'm going to go to you next. Arlie, did you hear me? Or maybe his screen is frozen.
To me. Okay.
Yes.
Well, after listening to this discussion, it becomes very clear what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been saying, that it's the arrogance of the leaders of the West which has prevented them from acknowledging that they're failing, that their system is failing, that the world is turning away from them. But they are failing. Reality is hitting. And the question then is, do we need, as I think it was either Larry or Ray said, some kind of military catastrophe that forces a change in the West? Or will the people seize the initiative and force those changes to adopt a new strategic and development architecture? But there's no question that you can have newspaper headlines hyping the slowing of inflation or the job figures or any of these particulars. But the polls tell you that most people in most Western countries don't trust their government. They don't like their government. In many cases, they fear their government. And this question of the arrogance and the egotism of leaders, or perhaps the greed and the corruption, is putting them on the wrong side of history. And there's a point at which that changes. I mean, Putin or Lavrov calls it a tectonic shift is occurring in the world. If you don't see that, you're just not paying attention. And it really does require the courage of the individual citizen to act on their truly human sense of identity, to look at what's being done to Ukraine, look what's being done to the civilian population in Palestine, in Gaza, and to take that into your heart to inspire you to act. And as I said, I think history and reality are on our side. Truth is on our side. It's a question of will enough people get out into the streets and make the changes that are necessary.
You're going to get the last word today. Is he there? I don't see him. Yes, he is. Very, very good. So, and I'm going to put it this way to you. this morning we were having a discussion about the need to get people to support and not allow people to attack Secretary General Guterres for what became a courageous stand at the point that clearly the United States, Israel, others were very unhappy with him. And he insisted after the December 8th vote, he gave a press conference on December 10th and saying, well, I'm just going to keep calling for what I'm calling for. And then, of course, the subsequent vote occurred at the United Nations on the 12th, with 153 nations voting as they did. So we were emphasizing, hey, we got to support not merely him, but individuals taking this kind of stand. Because, no organization really ultimately stands up for good. Individuals stand up for good. And so, as a sort of the final word, as you will, of what we're going to be talking about here, you've had to do that. You've encouraged that be done. We certainly want to go to, I keep referencing, everybody's got a city councilman, everybody's got a mayor, everybody's got a state representative, a state senator, everybody's got a governor. In the case of the United States, we're talking here, okay? Everybody's got a congressman and a senator, all right? And so that is all there. And even if you don't like any of these people, the point is that the power of government and of self-government is with the people should they choose to exercise it. And so this will be the final, as we sort of end up here. What do you have to say to people who, for good reason, are despairing, for good reason, think that they aren't going to be moved things, but yet at the same time see the necessity to stop that carnage that's ongoing in Gaza?
Am I on?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Let me say this: that when I was a freshman in college, each professor was giving me so much homework as though he was or she was the only professor I had. I got really upset, and I asked to talk to my English teacher, who happened to be a Jesuit, and I said, I want to talk to him. He said, all right, come on in. Well, come in Saturday morning, 7:20. So I go into where he was in the dorm, and he's shaving. He says, all right, what can I do for you, Ray? And I said, well, you've given me so much stuff, and I'm trying to play basketball here, and I'm getting discouraged. He turns at me, takes his razor, throws it in the basin. I said, what'd you say? And I got pissed off. Right? I said, I'm getting disgusted. And he goes, whew, I thought you said discouraged. Discouraged is not allowed. Disgusted, that's good. That's really good. That will move you to action. We can talk about disgusted. Discouraged, we can't talk about. Okay? So, discouraged is not for us. We have to do what we can. Now, we can't expect immediate results. We can't even expect results sometimes in somebody like my lifetime, okay? We have to do what we can. And the stakes are very high. But we still can live and breathe in a free society pretty much, okay? So, as many people have said, we've got to put our body into it. We've got to make our reluctance to see genocide proceed in our name. I mean, my God, what else should motivate us to the point of taking the kinds of risks that some of these young people, some people that have been encouraged by the Schiller Institute, are now doing? I'm not in Washington anymore. My wife says I can't get arrested anymore. Well, that's okay. I've done my part. But I applaud those who are willing to block things like the Jewish Voice for Peace, of which I'm a proud member, and other Code Pink and other like organizations that really need to come to the fore, as they did before Iraq, before the attack on Iraq. This time it's going to work because there's an election coming up, and even if justice does not prevail in the White House, politics will, We have to do the politics. We have to make an impression. And I think we can if we all do our part. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. I want to thank everybody, Larry Johnson, who had to get going, Mike Robinson, Harley Slanger, Ray McGovern, for what what you had to say today. And I just want to say to people who are listening, the next week is going to be pivotal for what we are trying to actually do as a whole. And there's a lot of different things going on. Much of it is at some of the different sites. One of the things, for example, that the Humanity for Peace organization is doing is next Thursday evening in New York City. There'll be a showing of the Hiroshima 815 movie. And the author of the bookend movie, Dr. Akiko Mikamu, will be with us here in New York. It will be available by means of a live Zoom stream, so you can catch the movie that way. And we strongly advise that you might do that. You can go to various sites. Maybe we can put that up at the end for you for that information. But besides that, and right away, what we want is that everyone give voice to the need to stop this carnage. We should have a ceasefire before Christmas. But of course, we don't control that, except we do control what we ourselves have to say about these matters and how we see them. What we're going to do today is we're going to conclude with something which is a part of a speech given by Adam Clayton Powell to a group in Massachusetts. It's become famous, it's well known. And what he's addressing is people's sense of impotence or powerlessness because of their lack of circumstance. And we're going to let it speak for itself. We want to thank you all for listening, and we want to thank you for what you're about to do to work with us to not only stop what the carnage is in Gaza, but campaign for a new security and development architecture, a new plan for progress in the world.
As I know here, you're in trouble, where it says about 30% are unemployed. That's why I'm working hard to get this surplus food here. Some of you say to me, well, I'm not like you. I'm not a congressman. I haven't got education. I haven't got work. But you're a human being. And you know what you've got? You've got in your hand the power to use your vote and to use even those few cents you get from welfare to spend them only where you want to spend them. A young slave boy stood one day before the greatest ruler of his day. And God said to Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses said, Lord, only I've got a stick, that's all. He said, well, let me use what's in your hand. And God used that slave boy with a stick in his hand to divide the Red Seas, march through a wilderness, bring water out of rocks, manna from heaven, and bring his people to freedom land. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? George Washington Carver, who was so frail that he was traded for a broken-down horse as a slave boy. And George Washington Carver, sitting in the science laboratory at Tuskegee, told me, he said, Dr. Powell, he said, I just go out in the fields each morning at 5 o'clock, and I let God guide me. And I bring back these little things and work them over my laboratory, and that man did more to revolutionize the agricultural science of peanuts and of cotton and sweet potato than any other human being in the field of agricultural science. What's in your hand? Just let God use you, that's all. What's in your hand? I've got a string in my hand, that's all, and I'm flying a kite. And way up in the heavens, lightning strikes it. And I, Benjamin Franklin, discover for the first time the possibilities of electricity with a string in my hand. What's in your hand? Little hunchback sitting in a Roman jail? I haven't got anything in my hand but an old quill pen, but God says, write what I tell you to write. Paul wrote, I have run my race with patience. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there's laid up in me a pot of faith. What's in your hand, little boy? All I've got is a slingshot. And the enemies of my people are great and big and more numerous than we are. Well, little David, go down to the brook and pick out a few stones and come on back. And close your eyes if you want to, and pull back that slingshot and let it go. And David killed the biggest enemy, the leader of the giants, against his people, and his people became free, just letting God guide a stone in his hand. And a few years passed, and David is a king. And God says, what's in your hand? He said, I've got a harp in my hand. He said, well, David, play on your harp. And he played, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Leadeth me beside still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley and the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? Man hanging on a cross. I've got 2 nails in my hand. Father, I stretch my hands to thee. No other help I know. If thou withdraws thyself from me, whither shall I go? And that man, with 2 nails in his hand, split history in half, BC and AD. And what's in your hand tonight, people of Cambridge? You've got God in your hand, and he'll let you win, because he's on your side and one with God, always in the majority. So walk with him, and talk with him, and work with him, and stick together, and fight together. And with God's hand in your hand, the victory will be accomplished here, sooner than you dreamed, sooner than you hoped, sooner than you prayed for, sooner than you imagined. Good night, and God bless you.